Thanks for joining me for my paper, Attracting the Public's Attention, the Amplification of Secular Views by the Freethought Press. So the freethinkers that I'm talking about today occupied a marginal position in Victorian Britain. Membership of the National Secular Society peaked at just a few thousand, and while circulation figures are difficult to ascertain, sales of even the most successful weekly journals arising from the movement, the National Reformer and the Freethinker, rarely exceeded 10,000. However, due to the dangers that many believed atheism and secularism posed to society, and legal cases involving Charles Bradlaugh, Annie Besant and George W. Foote, all of whom edited the movement's periodicals, the words and actions of this minority group came to occupy a significant position within the public consciousness. As Charles Laporte observes in Victorian Poets and the Changing Bible, warnings and anxieties about religious crisis and declining observance often attest to, quote, the Victorians' impressions of secularization rather than secularization per se. Three of the movement's strategies, which were both enacted and recounted by Freethought periodicals, were publishing anti-religious content intended to provoke outrage, engaging prominent figures in debates on and off the page, recounting activist successes to empower readers to challenge religious authorities themselves. While these overlapped, in this paper I focus on the first of them, taking the early years of George W. Foote's The Freethinker as a case study, and I consider how those who edited and wrote for these periodicals embraced and capitalized upon their notoriety to challenge the place of religion in society, seemingly providing support for the old adage, all publicity is good publicity. So this One Penny Weekly was established in 1881 on the basis that it was a provocative and proactively anti-Christian organ. Foote's editorial in the first issue emphasised that its approach, quote, must therefore be chiefly aggressive. It will wage relentless war against superstition. It will not scruple to employ for the same purpose any weapons of ridicule or sarcasm that may be borrowed from the armoury of common sense. The rhetoric of its editorials, topics found in articles and correspondence columns, and recounting of coverage in mainstream periodicals suggests how this strategy amplified minority voices such as Foote's and consequently destabilised the relationship between centre and periphery, enabling freethinkers to play an outsized role in shaping British perceptions of religion as under attack in the second half of the 19th century. I take as my starting point Foote's comment in a Freethinker editorial published on the 30th of October 1881, just a few months after he began publication. He said, "The public nowadays is in a great hurry. You must attract its attention before you can be heard." While some high-profile freethinkers sought to attract attention by emphasising the respectability of their secular ideology, most notably George Jacob Holyoake, who coined the term secularism and wanted to disassociate his cause from the perceived offensiveness of the atheism championed by his contemporaries, such as Bradlaugh. But others actively courted outrage, and in this paper I'm considering how this latter approach was embraced by the Freethinker as edited by George W. Foote from 1881 until his death in 1915, although I'm actually focusing very much on the first few years of its publication. So others have written quite comprehensively about the blasphemy cases brought against the Freethinker in 1882 and 83. These legal challenges focused on the comic Bible cartoons that appeared on the front page across the 1880s, and also the infamous 1882 Christmas number, from which you can see some things on the slide, which featured an irreverent A New Life of Christ and teamed with profane jokes. David Nash describes Foote's publication of this content as, quote, calculated to inflame public opinion and activate the creaking and unwieldy machinery of blasphemy laws, which he succeeded in doing. Foote revelled in being, in his words, on the devil's side, but he emphasised that despite charges from opponents that the publication was foul and filthy, he said, "No filth ever appears in our pages except what is derived from the Bible," which is to say that, as you can see, for example, in this cartoon of Moses getting a back view, it's a literal interpretation of a biblical line or two. So it's not, they're saying that we're not actually bringing anything new. What we say is already in the Bible. Joss Marsh has shown how the resultant course cases and the media discourse that surrounded them thus pivoted on the manner in which irreligious content was presented. Indeed, Lord Coleridge ruled in Foot's trial that if, quote, the decencies of controversy are observed, even the fundamentals of religion may be attacked without a person being guilty of blasphemous libel. An editorial printed in The Observer on the 11th of March 1883 articulated why this strategy was, from their perspective, doomed to fail. They said, "We venture to think that Mr. Foot will get very little sympathy from the general public, and as little or less from advanced thinkers who, being men of education, have not cared to state their views in an offensive shape. That in comparison to the sincere beliefs of Quakers, Jews and Unitarians," the editorial continues, quote, "an atheist of the proletizing school can only make his living by throwing mud. It becomes a public duty to teach him that throwing mud is a public nuisance and is not to be tolerated." So characterizing the freethinkers' content as trivial, a public nuisance, and insincere, the editorial undermines free thought as a genuine identity on a par with dissenting Christian denominations and Judaism. However, in conflating these two things, the editorial overlooks that irreverence can arise from sincerely held beliefs, and as such really misunderstands the freethinkers' rationale. The freethinker was explicit in its aim to ridicule religion and potentially cause offence. As Joseph Symes concluded in his 1882 article in praise of ridicule, quote, "We don't play with satire, we fight with it. There is no venom in it, but we are in earnest." So through the 1880s, before, during and after the legal challenges, regular columns were titled Profane Jokes, Comic Bible Sketches, Rib Ticklers and Acid Drops, the latter highlighting bad and hypocritical behaviour from religious people and institutions. Indeed, the irreligious humour spills out of such columns and pervades other elements of the periodical that usually serve more prosaic functions. Correspondence columns might on first glance seem a purely practical way to engage with reader letters, but Foot repurposed them for heretical comic effect. In this example from the Christmas 1882 issue, the Holy Ghost is advised that he'll need to pay child support if proven to be the father of the child. And I'd be intrigued to know if this sort of playful use of correspondence columns is something anyone else has come across elsewhere. So Foot's desire to capitalise on this notoriety is clear. From 16th of July 1882 until the 24th of February 1884, which was the last issue before Foot's release from Holloway Prison, "Prosecuted for blasphemy" was trumpeted at the top of the front page in a font almost as large as the periodical's title. From the 18th of March 1883, the details of the sentences for editor, printer and proprietor were also noted on the masthead. But was the publicity generated by the course cases successful in raising the periodical's profile in a way that benefited Foot and other free thinkers? Foot's New Year column in 1883 attested to the Freethinker doubling its circulation over the preceding year, during which the first of the prosecutions had been put forward. And Nash notes that this took it to around 10,000 per week in circulation, which is a really large number in the context of these kinds of radical periodicals. In later issues, it's noted that the new prosecution has, of course, occasioned a renewed demand for the Christmas number. And a correspondent identified as anxious is reassured that they are being responsive to surges in interest. Quote, "We printed thousands of extra copies of the Freethinker last week, but not nearly enough for the enormous demand." But Foot also emphasises the publicity's more intangible impact in his New Year's address. Its increased public profile meant that, quote, "the Freethinker is now an institution." From Foot's perspective, therefore, after less than 2 years of publication, the furore surrounding the periodical had given it a sense of legitimacy, purpose, and even permanence, despite the justice system's best attempts to the contrary. In this short column, Foot also praises, quote, "the many friends who have helped to give the Freethinker publicity in various ways," a comment that may be understood to have two quite different meanings. The first of the meanings is that readers were proactively circulating the Freethinker. In advance of the initial trial in January 1883, Foote wrote, quote, "We ask all our readers to push the paper as far as they possibly can. A special effort will be needed to counteract the intimidation of news agents. Every friend of free thought should make it a personal question." People responded with gusto. An atheist blacksmith promises that he and his friends will, in the event of our conviction, take 2 copies of the Freethinker for every one they now purchase. And the following week, someone else escalated matters with a promise to take 6 copies a week. On the 25th of February 1883, it was reported that the prosecution of Henry Cattle, singled out among newsagents because he was a well-known free thinker, was being prosecuted for selling the Christmas number specifically. And the Freethinker noted that this had, quote, "frightened the newsagents, and we've received notice from several wholesale houses they can no longer supply it." It was therefore incumbent upon the readership to step up. Alternative modes of circulation are documented in subsequent correspondence columns. For example, BHG, "There cannot be a better plan than you describe. We have not the means to advertise all over the country, but if every reader of the Freethinker would circulate it among his acquaintances, we should soon double our circulation." And J. Burns, "We shall be glad to hear of many more who will, like you, offer to sell the Freethinker privately until the prosecutions have ceased." Working men's reading rooms are also identified as sites of distribution, while a Scottish bookseller vows to buy in copies and post the contents bill on his shop door. Despite Foote's repurposing of correspondence columns for comic effect in an earlier issue, their importance is clear throughout the period of prosecution, as they enabled communication and facilitated strategizing between the periodical and its readership. Although we can't be certain that all reader contributions are genuine, much of the contents has the ring of authenticity. However, even if certain letters are not real, they nonetheless function to praise and therefore encourage reader behaviours that would bring the Freethinker to a wider audience. But Foote's comment about the many friends who have helped give the Freethinker publicity in various ways can also be interpreted in a more tongue-in-cheek manner. The regular column Sugar Plums functioned as a record of the gains being made by the Freethought movement, and a significant proportion of the content was excerpts from newspaper coverage, which, even when not positive, nonetheless gave them free nationwide publicity. As Foote comments knowingly, "The press is beginning to find out there is a large public interest in Freethought." On the 11th of February 1883, one paragraph ran, quote, "The London Echo points out one of the constellations, to us, of our second prosecution. If people in future everywhere do not know something of the Freethinker, it will not be for want of advertising it in the House of Commons and the law courts." The Echo suggests that, having been provided with, quote, "gratuitous national advertisement, it will be more sought after and read than before," citing how sales of the Fruits of Philosophy were boosted tenfold by the reporting of proceedings against Bradlaugh and Besant in 1877. The following month, the Sugar Plums column gleefully recounts the Weekly Dispatch's anxieties about the foolishness of prosecutors' actions. Quote, "They profess themselves anxious to prevent the publication of opinions that are offensive to them and to punish those who publish them. But they are all they are contriving to do is to advertise the former and glorify the latter." Foote's harsh sentencing stimulated further responses, several of which were concerned that 12 months imprisonment reflected badly upon Britain's acceptance of dissent. The Spectator, for example, posited that considering the extreme severity of the punishment inflicted for publishing what no one was compelled to either see or read, no one will be able to avoid comparing what Mr. Foote has done with what more refined assailants of the Christian faith have done without the smallest risk of prosecution, and suggested it was an attack specifically on working class freedom of speech. While it cannot be said that Foote was glorified in the popular press, this indication of concern for the prosecution's wider implications is indicative of how such publicity had the potential to soften attitudes towards the Freethought cause. So within the movement, the reaction to Foote's combative approach was mixed. Many of his fellow freethinkers disagreed and advocated instead moderation and more good faith engagement with the religious. While Foote was an editor until his death in 1915, The tone as a freethinker changed quite markedly from the 1890s onwards, the front page cartoons having been dropped in 1889. However, columns of profane jokes remained, and the periodical continued to pride itself upon vehemently challenging religion and its hypocrisies. Unlike the majority of other freethought periodicals, the Freethinker continued to be published throughout the 20th century and still exists as an online publication today. While there are many factors that contributed to its longevity, it's certainly tempting to suggest that its rapid rise to prominence through the courting of notoriety stood it in good stead, drawing a fringe movement into the centre of popular journalism, and in doing so providing them with a heightened platform from which to draw others towards the freethought cause. Foote knew the strategy would be divisive, but that it nonetheless appealed to a certain minority. As he reflected in 1915, we were not writing to please purchasers, but to inspire evangelists. Thank you, and I look forward to talking more about this project in our panel.